Have you ever felt overlooked or tossed aside? Imagine being valued at just $75, the price of cheap hamburger, when you were once worth thousands. That's what happened to Daisy, an aging dairy cow with a hidden past, until one man's split-second decision changed everything. You'll discover how a forgotten champion found redemption, and how our most impulsive choices often lead to our greatest purpose. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you don't miss our animal rescue stories. Comment where you're watching from. I read every comment and love connecting with animal lovers worldwide. Now, let's head to a sweltering livestock auction in Texas where our story begins. The auction barn on the outskirts of Amarillo, Texas, reeked of manure, hay, and desperation. July heat pressed down like a hot iron. The temperature inside the metal-roofed structure climbing well past 95 degrees despite the industrial fans that fought a losing battle against the sweltering afternoon. Dust particles danced in the slanted rays of sunlight that broke through gaps in the weathered walls, illuminating the sea of cowboy hats and weathered faces that filled the tiered seating. Hank Peterson wiped sweat from his brow with a faded blue bandana. At 57, his face was a roadmap of hard work. Deep creases around kind blue eyes, skin weathered by decades under the Kansas sun. Unlike most of the attendees, Hank hadn't come to buy. His friend Bill Reynolds had dragged him along for company on the 4-hour drive south. "Look at that Holstein Friesian cross," Bill whispered, nudging Hank's ribs. "She'll give at least 8 gallons daily with proper feed. Bet she goes for north of 2,000. Hank nodded politely, his attention drifting. The auctioneer's rapid-fire delivery blended into background noise as cattle paraded through one by one. Young heifers with promising genetics and prime beef cattle commanded solid prices. The electronic board above the auctioneer's stand flashing numbers that reflected a decent market. Lot 37. 5-year-old Angus bull, excellent breeding stock, the auctioneer called, his voice carrying through crackling speakers. 2 hours in, the energy in the room shifted. The premium stock had been sold, and now came what old-timers called the dregs, older animals, those with defects, or ones simply past their prime production years. Next up, Lot 58. Jersey cow, age, approximately 12 to 14 years. A ripple of disinterested murmurs spread through the crowd. Elderly dairy cows rarely attracted serious bidders. Most would go straight to slaughter for low-grade processing. Through the gate came a thin, caramel-colored Jersey cow. Her coat lacked luster, hanging loosely over protruding hip bones. Her udder showed signs of past productivity, but now hung nearly empty. Yet something in her large brown eyes caught Hank's attention, a quiet dignity, perhaps, or a resignation that struck him as profoundly human. Starting bid at $150. Do I hear $150? The auctioneer's voice lacked its earlier enthusiasm. Silence filled the barn. All right, $100? Folks, she's still got some weight on her. A meat processor in the back lazily raised his number. $75. $75. We have $75. Anyone else? Going once. Bill leaned over. Poor old girl. Hamburger by nightfall. Something twisted in Hank's chest. The cow's eyes seemed to meet his own across the dusty arena. $200, Hank called out, surprising himself as much as everyone else. The auctioneer blinked. We have $200 from number 42. Any advance on $200? The processor shook his head, muttering something to his companion. Son, that cow ain't worth half that. A large man in front of Hank grumbled without turning around. Meat won't even be tender. Bill stared at his friend. Hank, what the hell are you doing? $200 going once, going twice. Sold to bidder number 42. As the old Jersey was led away, Bill grabbed Hank's arm. Have you lost your mind? Your pasture barely supports the 3 head you already have. Hank watched the cow disappear through the exit gate, her tail swishing weakly at persistent flies. She deserves better than becoming dog food, Bill. Hank's voice was quiet but firm. Everyone deserves a dignified ending. It's just a cow, Hank. Not your Sarah. Hank's jaw tightened at the mention of his late wife. This has nothing to do with Sarah. But as he filled out the paperwork, paying cash for the cow the auction staff had named Daisy on her temporary documentation, Hank wondered if perhaps it had everything to do with Sarah after all. She'd always had a soft spot for the underdogs, the forgotten, the discarded. As Hank walked out to arrange transport for his unexpected purchase, the auction manager, a balding man with a permanent scowl, stopped him. Peterson, right? Look, I can tear up this paperwork. That jersey is 1 foot in the boneyard already. Hank shook his head. She's coming home with me. The man shrugged. Your money, your funeral. What are you calling her? Hank thought about it for just a moment. Daisy. Her name is Daisy. The Tulane Highway stretched ahead like a black ribbon across the golden Kansas prairie as Hank's weathered blue Ford F-150 rumbled northward. The borrowed livestock trailer rattled behind, carrying its unexpected cargo. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rolling fields of wheat and corn that flanked the road, painting the landscape in hues of amber and gold. Bill had taken his own truck back separately, shaking his head in disbelief at what he called Hank's moment of senility. The cab of Hank's truck felt unusually quiet without his friend's constant chatter. $200, Hank muttered to himself, gripping the steering wheel tighter. Sarah would have called it a waste too. He glanced in his rearview mirror at the trailer. Through the metal slats, he could occasionally glimpse Daisy's caramel hide. The old cow had barely resisted loading, moving with the slow, plodding gait of an animal that had given up fighting its fate long ago. Hank's modest farm appeared on the horizon, 120 acres that had been in the Peterson family for 3 generations. Nothing fancy, a 2-story white farmhouse with peeling paint, a red barn in need of repairs, and a few outbuildings scattered about like weathered toys. His 3 other cattle grazed lazily in the distance, black dots against the green pasture. As he pulled into the gravel driveway, his border collie, Max, came bounding across the yard, barking excitedly. Easy, boy, Hank called as he parked beside the barn. We've got company. The screen door of the farmhouse slammed, and Hank's daughter, Jenny, appeared on the porch. At 32, she was the spitting image of her mother, same auburn hair, same skeptical tilt of the head as she watched her father climb down from the truck. Dad, what's with the trailer? I thought you were just going to the auction with Bill to look around. Hank scratched his stubbled chin. Well, that was the plan. Jenny descended the porch steps, arms crossed. Since her mother's passing 3 years ago, she'd made a habit of driving out from Topeka every other weekend to check on him. Today, her timing was inconvenient. Please tell me you didn't buy another piece of equipment you don't need. Hank moved to the back of the trailer. Not exactly. When he lowered the ramp and Daisy emerged, hesitantly, as if expecting a trick, Jenny's jaw dropped. You bought a cow? And not just any cow, but... She trailed off, staring at the bony, tired animal that stood blinking in the sunlight. Her name's Daisy, Hank said defensively. Dad, she's ancient. What were you thinking? We talked about this. The farm barely breaks even as it is. Hank led Daisy toward the barn, the old Jersey following with slow, deliberate steps. She was headed for the slaughterhouse, Jenny. Nobody wanted her. So you paid good money for an animal that's 1 hoof in the grave? Jenny's voice rose in frustration. This isn't like taking in another stray cat. Cattle are expensive to maintain. Inside the barn, Hank prepared a stall with fresh hay and filled a water trough. Daisy watched him, her large eyes following his movements. Your mother would have done the same thing, he said quietly. Jenny's anger deflated slightly. Mom was also practical. This isn't practical, Dad. It's compassion, Hank finished. Sometimes that's more important than practicality. Jenny sighed, leaning against the stable door. How much? 200. 200, Dad. That's the electric bill, and then some. Hank knelt down, examining Daisy's front legs. They showed signs of wear, but nothing serious. I'll figure it out. Always have. Jenny watched as her father moved around the cow with gentle efficiency, checking her hooves, her ears, running experienced hands along her flanks. What are you even going to do with her? She asked, her tone softening despite herself. Hank paused. He hadn't thought that far ahead. Let her live out her days in peace, I guess. Give her green pasture, clean water. Simple dignities. As darkness fell, Hank and Jenny sat on the porch, nursing mugs of coffee. The evening's symphony of crickets and distant coyote calls filled the comfortable silence between them. You know, Jenny finally said, this is exactly the kind of impulsive thing Mom used to get mad at you for. Hank smiled sadly, and then she'd come around and act like it was her idea all along. They shared a quiet laugh, memories of Sarah briefly warming the space between them. 1 month, Jenny said firmly. If that cow becomes a financial burden in 1 month, we sell her. Deal. Hank glanced toward the barn where Daisy was settled in for the night. Deal. Later, after Jenny had gone to bed in her old room, Hank returned to the barn with a flashlight. Daisy was lying in the straw, her breathing steady. Don't know what came over me today, he whispered, reaching out to scratch behind her ears. But I'm going to make sure you get a fair shake. That's all any of us can ask for, isn't it? A fair shake at the end. Daisy's large eyes reflected the flashlight's beam, inscrutable yet somehow knowing. For a moment, Hank could have sworn she understood every word. The first rays of dawn painted the eastern sky in delicate strokes of pink and gold when Hank stepped onto his porch, steaming coffee mug in hand. The air carried the earthy scent of morning dew and promised another scorching July day. His gaze drifted to the barn where his new purchase had spent her first night. A mix of doubt and determination churned in his stomach. What exactly had he gotten himself into? Max trotted at his heels as Hank made his way across the yard, work boots leaving dark imprints in the damp grass. The farm was coming alive, birds chattering from fence posts, his small herd of cattle already grazing in the distance, their black shapes stark against the verdant pasture. When Hank pushed open the barn door, he half expected to find Daisy collapsed in her stall. Instead, the old Jersey cow was standing, watching the entrance expectantly. Her large eyes tracked him as he approached. "Morning, old girl," Hank said, reaching for a pitchfork. "Let's see about getting you settled proper." Jenny appeared in the doorway, hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, wearing one of her mother's old flannel shirts despite the heat. "Need help? Thought you'd sleep in," Hank replied, surprised. "And miss witnessing Dad's midlife crisis firsthand? Not a chance." Her tone was teasing, but her eyes held genuine concern. Together, they set about integrating Daisy into the farm routine. Hank mixed a special feed with extra nutrients while Jenny examined the cow more thoroughly in the morning light. "She's severely malnourished," Jenny observed, running gentle hands along Daisy's protruding ribs. "And look at her hooves. They haven't been properly trimmed in ages." Hank frowned. "Can you do something about that?" Jenny had inherited her mother's touch with animals, choosing veterinary studies before settling into her current research position at Kansas State University. "I'll call Dr. Martinez. He owes me a favor. Might come out this afternoon." She paused, examining a patch of rough skin on Daisy's neck. "Dad, this cow has been neglected for a long time." After breakfast, Hank led Daisy from the barn into the smallest pasture, adjacent to the house. The old cow stepped tentatively onto the lush grass, as if suspecting some trick. She lowered her head, took a hesitant bite, then another. Watching her, Hank felt an unexpected lump form in his throat. "When's the last time you had fresh pasture, girl?" he murmured. By mid-afternoon, Dr. Martinez's truck bounced up the driveway. The veterinarian, a stocky man with salt and pepper hair and perpetually sunburned cheeks, spent nearly an hour examining Daisy. "She's in rough shape, Hank," he concluded, packing away his equipment. "Malnourished, slight respiratory infection, hooves need serious work. But nothing fatal, surprisingly enough." He glanced at Jenny. "Your daughter tells me you bought her at auction? For $200. Hank shifted uncomfortably. "That about sums it up." Dr. Martinez chuckled. "Well, she's at least 12 years old, maybe older. Past her prime for sure, but Jerseys can live to 20 with proper care." He handed Hank a list of medications and supplements. "Follow this regimen, and she might surprise you yet." After the vet left, Hank and Jenny implemented his recommendations immediately. They trimmed Daisy's hooves as best they could, administered medication for her respiratory infection, and set up a feeding schedule with nutrient-rich supplements. Days passed in the steady rhythm of farm life. Every morning, Hank rose before sunrise to check on Daisy before tending to his other chores. Bit by bit, a change became noticeable. Her coat began to regain some luster, her eyes grew brighter, and though still thin, her frame no longer seemed quite so fragile. What surprised Hank most was Daisy's behavior. Unlike his other cattle that maintained a healthy distance, Daisy would approach the fence whenever he appeared, watching his work with an intensity that sometimes unnerved him. "It's like she's studying me," he mentioned to Jenny over dinner one evening. Jenny smiled. "She probably hasn't experienced kindness in years. She's just grateful." "Do you think cows feel gratitude?" Hank asked, genuinely curious. They're more intelligent than people give them credit for, Jenny replied. They form social bonds, recognize faces, even hold grudges. She took a sip of water. They definitely feel something like gratitude in their own way. When Sunday arrived, Jenny packed her car to return to Topeka. You sure you'll be okay? She asked, looking toward the pasture where Daisy was grazing. I can come back next weekend if you need help. Hank hugged his daughter. We'll be fine. You've got your own life to tend to. After Jenny's car disappeared down the driveway, Hank walked out to Daisy's pasture. The sun was beginning its westward descent, casting long shadows across the land. To his surprise, Daisy approached the fence, regarding him with those expressive eyes. Just you and me now, girl, he said, reaching out to stroke her neck. That evening, as Hank sat on his porch watching fireflies begin their nightly dance, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced since Sarah's passing. His farm, once merely a place of habit and obligation, felt alive again. The empty chair beside him still ached with Sarah's absence, but the hollow feeling in his chest had eased, if only slightly. Sarah, he whispered to the darkening sky, I think I might have done something right for once. From the pasture came the soft lowing of cattle settling in for the night. And for the first time in years, Hank Peterson slept without dreams of what he had lost, but rather with vague, hopeful images of what might yet be. August heat shimmered across the Kansas landscape, bending the horizon into watery mirages that danced atop the asphalt county road. Hank wiped sweat from his brow as he mended a section of fence near the eastern pasture, occasionally glancing toward Daisy, who grazed contentedly nearby. The transformation in the old Jersey cow over the past 3 weeks had been remarkable. Though still thin, her coat had regained a healthy sheen, and her eyes were bright and alert. Max lay in the shade of a lone cottonwood, tongue lolling as he occasionally raised his head to ensure his master was still in sight. The quiet rhythm of hammering fence staples was broken only by distant birdsong and the occasional lowing of cattle. The rumble of an approaching truck drew Hank's attention. A faded blue Chevy pickup with rust spots blooming along the wheel wells pulled up alongside his property. Hank straightened, recognizing the vehicle belonging to his nearest neighbor, Tom Sullivan. At 78, Tom was something of a local legend, a third-generation cattleman whose knowledge of livestock was unmatched in 3 counties. His family had once owned the largest dairy operation in the region before corporate farms changed the landscape of American agriculture. These days, Tom kept to himself on his modest remaining acreage, emerging mainly for church on Sundays and the occasional visit to neighbors. "Morning, Tom," Hank called, setting down his hammer and wiping his palms on his jeans. Tom eased himself from the truck with the deliberate movements of a man whose joints protested more with each passing year. His weathered face crinkled into a smile beneath the brim of his stained Stetson. "Saw you working from my place," Tom replied, gesturing vaguely eastward. "Thought I'd stop and see how you're faring in this heat." The 2 men stood in companionable silence for a moment, surveying the pasture where Hank's small herd grazed. "Jenny called me," Tom said finally. "Mentioned you took in a rescue case." Hank chuckled. "Is that what she's calling it? Guess that sounds better than Dad's moment of insanity." "Mind if I take a look?" Tom asked, interest evident in his sharp blue eyes. "Been working with jerseys my whole life. Might offer some advice." They walked together toward where Daisy grazed, separated slightly from Hank's 3 Angus cattle. Tom's experienced gaze assessed the cow with professional interest. "She's coming along nicely," he observed. "Good calcium supplement program?" Hank nodded, following Dr. Martinez's recommendations to the letter. Tom circled the cow slowly. "Mind if we bring her in closer? Something about her seems familiar." Curious, Hank retrieved a bucket with a small amount of feed, using it to coax Daisy toward the fence. The old cow approached willingly, her trust in Hank now well established. Tom moved with surprising agility for his age, stepping closer to examine Daisy's features. His eyes narrowed as he studied her head, then moved to her flanks. Suddenly, he froze. "Hank," he said, voice oddly tight, "where exactly did you get this cow?" "Amarillo Livestock Auction." "What?" Tom pointed to a spot on Daisy's right flank, partially hidden by her improving coat condition. "See that mark there? That's not just any brand." Hank crouched down to look where Tom was pointing. A faded but distinct mark was visible, an ornate MB, inside what appeared to be a crown or horseshoe shape. "I've been looking at a cattle brand," Tom said, removing his hat to wipe his brow. "That's the Meadowbrook mark." "God almighty, Hank. Do you have any idea what you've got here?" Hank straightened, confused. "Just an old jersey that needed a home." Tom's expression shifted to one of profound disbelief. "Son, this isn't just any jersey. The Meadowbrook Dairy in Vermont was to milk cows what Kentucky's Calumet Farm was to thoroughbreds. They produced some of the finest dairy cattle in North America for nearly 60 years. Skepticism crossed Hank's face. "Tom, no offense, but Daisy was practically being sold for dog food when I bought her." "Let me see her teeth," Tom insisted. Reluctantly, Hank helped position Daisy's head while Tom gently examined her mouth with practiced hands. The older man's excitement grew palpable. "This girl's around 14, maybe 15 years old. The timing fits." Tom stepped back, shaking his head in amazement. "I'd bet my best bull that this cow has a story behind her, and it's no ordinary one." Hank frowned. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," Tom said, fixing Hank with an intense gaze, "that this old girl might have been something special once. Something extraordinary." He ran a weathered hand along Daisy's neck. "Look at her conformation, even now. The head profile, the udder attachment, classic Meadowbrook bloodlines." "You're reading too much into this," Hank protested. "It's just a coincidence." Tom replaced his hat, a stubborn set to his jaw. "Meadowbrook closed down about 7 years ago, financial troubles after the founder died. Their herd was dispersed across the country." He paused, eyes distant with memory. "There was one cow, their crown jewel. Won championships all over the Northeast. They called her Golden Bell." Hank supplied automatically, remembering the 6th point in the story structure he'd received. "That's right," Tom said, surprised. "How did you know?" Hank blinked, momentarily confused himself. "I must have read about it somewhere." Tom turned back to Daisy, who was calmly eating from the bucket Hank held. "Records are probably out there somewhere. Registry numbers, lineage documentation." His voice took on an urgency that belied his age. "Hank, if this is who I think it might be, you've stumbled on something remarkable." "Tom," Hank said gently, "even if she was some champion once, she's just an old cow now. What difference does it make?" The older man looked at him with an expression mixing pity and exasperation. "The difference between finding a broken-down Ford Pinto in a junkyard and discovering a neglected 1967 Shelby Mustang. That's what." He shook his head. "Some things retain their value, their importance, even when they're not at their best anymore." As Tom climbed back into his truck, he rolled down the window. "I'm going to make some calls, check some old registry books. Don't be surprised if this old girl has a pedigree longer than both our family trees combined." After Tom's departure, Hank remained by the fence, watching Daisy with new eyes. Could it be possible? The idea seemed absurd. Championship cows didn't end up forgotten at small-town Texas auctions. Yet something in Tom's certainty had planted a seed of curiosity. "Just who are you, Daisy?" Hank murmured, scratching behind her ears. The cow gazed back at him with those intelligent eyes, keeping whatever secrets she might hold close to her bovine heart. September arrived with the first hints of autumn, painting the edges of maple leaves with crimson and gold. Morning fog draped itself across Hank's pastures like a gossamer blanket, gradually burning away as the sun climbed higher. The land was preparing for its seasonal transformation, and Daisy, too, continued her remarkable metamorphosis. 2 months after her arrival, the once skeletal Jersey cow had filled out considerably. Her caramel coat gleamed with health, and her movements had become more energetic, almost youthful. Dr. Martinez had pronounced her recovery nothing short of miraculous during his follow-up visit last week. Hank was mucking out stalls in the barn when the familiar sound of Tom Sullivan's truck announced his arrival. The old cattleman had become a frequent visitor since discovering the mysterious brand on Daisy's flank, often bringing yellowed farming journals or printouts from agricultural websites. "You're just in time," Hank called as Tom approached the barn. "I could use a break." Tom's expression stopped him short. The older man clutched a manila folder to his chest, eyes bright with excitement. "Found her," Tom announced without preamble, his voice trembling slightly. "Took some doing, but I found her." Hank leaned his pitchfork against the wall. "Found who?" "Your Daisy." Tom thrust the folder toward Hank. "Or should I say, Meadowbrook's Golden Bell." Inside the folder were photocopies of registry documents, newspaper clippings, and several glossy photographs. Hank spread them across an empty feed barrel, staring in disbelief at the images. They showed a magnificent Jersey cow with a gleaming coat, proudly standing in show rings with blue ribbons adorning her halter. "This can't be the same animal," Hank protested, looking from the photographs to Tom. "Look at the registration details," Tom urged, pointing to a document. Meadowbrook's Golden Belle, born May 12, 2010. Distinguished by a white star-shaped mark on her forehead and the Meadowbrook brand on her right flank. Hank glanced toward Daisy's stall. The white star marking was still visible, though partially obscured by the cow's forelock. "Called my nephew in Vermont," Tom continued, animated in a way Hank had never seen before. "He's in the dairy business up there." Confirmed everything. Golden Belle was legendary, set a production record for butterfat content in 2014. Won the National Jersey Show 3 years running. Her calves sold for 5 figures each. Hank shook his head, overwhelmed. If she was so valuable, how did she end up at a Texas cattle auction? Tom sat heavily on a bale of hay, removing his hat. That's the sad part of the story. Meadowbrook Dairy was a family operation for generations. Old Man Harrington, Richard, was the last of the line. When he died, his city-dwelling nephews inherited. They knew nothing about dairy farming and cared even less. They sold off the operation? Piece by piece, Tom nodded grimly. The land went to developers. The equipment to auction. The herd was dispersed across the country. According to my nephew, Belle was sold to a dairy operation in Missouri, Lakeside Farms. Hank studied a newspaper clipping from 2015. The headline read, "Meadowbrook's Golden Belle sets new production records at national competition." "Then what happened?" he asked quietly. Tom sighed. Lakeside hit financial troubles in 2018. They sold most of their herd to a commercial dairy in Oklahoma. That's where things get murky. Belle was aging, her production declining naturally. Commercial operations have little use for older cows, no matter their pedigree. So she was sold again, Hank surmised. And again, and again. Tom's weathered face creased with sorrow. Each time to a smaller operation, each time for less money. Her registration papers got lost somewhere along the way. Without those papers, she was just another aging Jersey. Hank walked to Daisy's stall. The cow approached, nudging his hand affectionately. It seemed impossible that this gentle creature had once been the pride of one of America's most prestigious dairy farms. "I tracked her last registered sale to a small family farm near Lubbock in 2020, Tom continued. "They went bankrupt last spring. Must have sent their remaining livestock to the Amarillo auction, where no one recognized her," Hank finished. "Who would?" Tom stood, joining Hank at the stall. Without papers, without her condition, without someone who knew what to look for. Daisy, Belle, gazed at them with her large, expressive eyes. Hank wondered what memories lived behind that gentle gaze. Did she remember the show rings, the blue ribbons, the careful grooming and premium feed? Did she recall the gradual decline, the succession of strange barns and unfamiliar hands? "It's like finding out your yard sale purchase is actually a Rembrandt," Hank murmured, stroking Belle's neck. "More common than you'd think in the livestock world," Tom replied. "When times get hard, documentation is the first thing to go missing, especially when animals change hands multiple times." They stood in companionable silence for a moment. The only sounds the soft shuffling of Belle's hooves in the straw and distant bird calls from outside. "She had a health crisis in 2019, Tom said eventually, referring back to his notes. "Mastitis infection. Severe, but treatable with proper veterinary care." "Let me guess," Hank said bitterly. "They didn't want to spend the money on an aging cow." Tom nodded. Her production dropped during the infection. Commercial dairies operate on thin margins. They likely saw a cow past her prime with declining output and made a business decision. "A business decision," Hank repeated, the words tasting sour in his mouth. "To discard a living creature like a broken machine. That's modern agriculture for you," Tom said without judgment. Not much room for sentiment. Hank thought of Sarah, who had insisted on nursing injured wildlife back to health, who had kept ancient barn cats long past their mousing days, who had seen the worth in things beyond their utility. Perhaps his impulse to save Belle hadn't been so inexplicable after all. "Does it matter?" Hank asked suddenly. "Her being Golden Belle, I mean." She's still just an old cow who deserves a decent retirement. Tom's eyes crinkled at the corners. It matters in the sense that her genetics are valuable. Her history is important to the breed. And, he hesitated, there might be financial considerations too, if you were interested. Financial considerations? Her offspring would still carry significant value to the right buyers. Even at her age, with proper care, she might have a calf or two left in her. Or there's embryo transfer possibilities. Some breeders might pay handsomely to recover her bloodline. Hank frowned, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. I didn't save her to turn her into a breeding machine, Tom. Of course not. Tom raised his hands placatingly. Just saying there are options. Her identity has value. That's all. As Tom gathered his documents, promising to return with more information, Hank remained in the barn with Belle. The afternoon light slanted through gaps in the wooden walls, creating golden strips across the cow's back. Golden Belle, he whispered, testing the name. The cow's ears twitched in response. Is that who you are? The champion who fell from grace. Belle nudged his hand again, seeking affection rather than recognition. In that moment, Hank realized it didn't matter what name she answered to or what ribbon she had won. What mattered was the second chance that had brought them together, an aging widower and a forgotten champion, both finding unexpected purpose in their twilight years. Well, Miss Belle, Hank said softly, seems we both have histories worth knowing, and maybe futures still worth writing. The oak tree behind Hank's farmhouse blazed with autumn fire, its leaves a spectacular display of crimson and gold against the clear October sky. Beneath its spreading branches, Hank had set up 2 weathered Adirondack chairs. In one sat Jenny, home for the weekend, wrapped in a thick cardigan despite the mild afternoon. In the other, Tom Sullivan leaned forward, animated as he continued the tale of Golden Belle's remarkable journey. The Harrington family established Meadowbrook Dairy in 1952, Tom explained, referencing a leather-bound book of Jersey breed history he'd brought along. They were visionaries, implemented genetic selection programs decades before they became standard practice. Jenny sipped her coffee, watching Belle graze peacefully in the nearby pasture. The transformation in the cow over the past 3 months was nothing short of extraordinary. Her once protruding ribs were now covered with healthy flesh, her coat gleamed in the sunlight, and her eyes sparkled with vitality. Richard Harrington was a legend in dairy circles, Tom continued. When he acquired Belle's grandmother, Meadowbrook's Royal Duchess, from a farm in Guernsey, everyone thought he'd overpaid. $20,000 for a heifer calf in 1998 was unheard of. But he was right, Jenny surmised, her scientific mind engaged by the genetics discussion. Spectacularly right, Tom confirmed. Royal Duchess produced daughters that revolutionized the breed's butterfat production capacity. When Belle was born in the spring of 2010, Richard knew immediately she was something special. Hank had heard pieces of this story over the past month as Tom's research progressed, but seeing his daughter's growing interest made him appreciate the tale anew. By age 2, Belle was producing milk with the highest butterfat content ever recorded in the National Registry, Tom said, flipping to a page showing Belle in her prime, a magnificent animal bedecked with blue ribbons. At her peak, her milk was commanding premium prices from artisanal cheese makers across New England. Then what happened? Jenny asked, echoing the question Hank had posed weeks earlier. Tom's expression darkened. Richard Harrington died suddenly in February 2017. Heart attack while clearing snow from his driveway. No wife, no children, just 3 nephews who'd left Vermont decades ago for corporate jobs in Boston and New York. And they had no interest in dairy farming, Hank added. Worse than no interest, they had contempt for it, Tom replied. According to my sources, they visited exactly once after the funeral, pronounced the operation quaint but unsustainable, and hired a liquidation company to dismantle generations of work. Jenny shook her head in disbelief. They couldn't find a buyer for the entire operation? Several potential buyers stepped forward. The nephews wanted quick cash, not a prolonged sale process. The land alone, sold to developers, brought in millions. Tom's voice carried the weary resignation of someone who had seen this story play out countless times across rural America. Belle went to Lakeside Farms in Missouri, Hank supplied, now familiar with this part of the story. For 1/10 her actual value, Tom confirmed. Lakeside was a decent operation, but heavily leveraged. When milk prices bottomed out in 2018, they were among the first casualties. Jenny leaned forward, professional interest peaked. Is that when she had the mastitis? Tom nodded, impressed by her recall. August 2019. By then, she was owned by Sun Valley Dairy in Oklahoma, a large commercial operation. Belle was 7 years old, still valuable, but past her absolute prime. And they decided treatment wasn't worth the investment. Jenny said, clinical assessment tinged with disapproval. They administered basic antibiotics, but nothing more, Tom confirmed. No specialized care, no follow-up cultures. Just enough to keep her alive, not enough to restore her fully. Her production dropped by 60%. Hank watched Belle in the pasture, trying to reconcile the broken-down animal he'd purchased with both her illustrious past and her remarkable recovery. How did she end up at that Texas auction? Tom sighed, closing his book. After Sun Valley, she was sold to Hernandez Family Dairy near Lubbock. Small operation, about 50 head. Good people by all accounts, but hit hard by the drought of 2022. They held on longer than most, but finally filed for bankruptcy this spring. Their entire herd went to auction. By then, Belle was just number 58, an elderly Jersey with no documentation and declining production. A thoughtful silence fell over the trio. In the pasture, Belle raised her head, seeming to sense she was the topic of conversation. Hank couldn't help but wonder if some part of her remembered the applause of the show rings, the careful attention of handlers who had once valued her at tens of thousands of dollars. It's like a fall from aristocracy, Jenny mused. From the equivalent of bovine royalty to nearly becoming hamburger. The agricultural industry can be brutally efficient, Tom acknowledged. No room for sentimentality when margins are tight and bills are due. Hank remembered the meat processor at the auction, casually bidding $75 for what had once been a national champion. The thought made his chest tighten with a strange mixture of anger and gratitude. Anger at the system that had discarded her, gratitude that he had been there to intervene. When's the last time you tried milking her, Hank? Tom asked suddenly. The question caught him off guard. I haven't. Figured she was dry by now. Tom shook his head. Jersey cows can produce milk well into their teens with proper care. Belle's udder has been filling out since you got her healthy again. Haven't you noticed? Hank realized he had noticed, but hadn't given it much thought. His small operation wasn't set up for dairy production. Dad hasn't milked a cow since I was 10, Jenny said, smiling at a childhood memory. Remember that old Holstein, Patsy? You were terrible at it. Your mother was the one with the touch for milking, Hank admitted. I was always too rough or too hesitant. Never got the rhythm right. Tom stood, brushing off his jeans. Well, no time like the present to learn again. Let's see what the old champion can do. The three made their way to the barn, where Tom patiently showed Hank how to prepare Belle for milking. To everyone's surprise, the once champions stewed calmly during the process, as if remembering a long-forgotten routine. She's still got it, Tom proclaimed as milk streamed into the stainless steel bucket. Look at that cream line already forming. This isn't just milk, it's liquid gold. When they finished, Tom poured a small amount into 3 glasses. The ultimate test, he said, handing them around. Hank hesitated. Is it safe? We haven't had it tested or pasteurized. From a healthy cow, freshly collected? Tom scoffed. This is what milk is supposed to taste like, before processing strips away all the character. Jenny, ever the scientist, examined her glass critically before taking a cautious sip. Her eyes widened. Oh my God, she breathed. That's incredible. Encouraged, Hank tried his. The rich, sweet complexity bore no resemblance to the store-bought milk he was accustomed to. This was a revelation, creamy, slightly grassy, with a natural sweetness that lingered pleasantly. That, Tom said with satisfaction, is what made Belle a champion. Her milk composition is genetically superior, higher butterfat, perfect protein ratios, exceptional flavor profile. Even past her prime, she produces milk that would make artisanal cheese makers weep with joy. Later, after Tom had departed with promises to connect Hank with a laboratory that could analyze Belle's milk composition, father and daughter sat on the porch steps watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of amber and purple. You know, Jenny said thoughtfully, there's a whole movement toward heritage breeds and traditional farming methods. People pay premium prices for authenticity and quality. Hank glanced at her. What are you suggesting? Nothing definite, she replied, bumping his shoulder affectionately. Just that your impulsive rescue might turn out to be more than a charitable act. Belle still has value, not just as a former champion, but as a living link to dairy traditions we're losing. Hank watched Belle in the gathering dusk, her pale form ghostly against the darkening pasture. From national champion to discard to what? Redemption? Second chance. The story wasn't finished yet. Whatever happens, he said quietly, she deserves better than what fate had in store for her at that auction. Maybe you both do, Jenny replied softly, echoing thoughts Hank hadn't voiced even to himself. As stars began to prickle the eastern sky, Hank Peterson realized that in saving Belle, he might have inadvertently saved something in himself as well. A capacity for care, for purpose, for seeing value where others saw only decline. It was a humbling thought that a chance encounter with an old cow might change the course of his remaining years. We'll see where this goes, he said, more to himself than to Jenny. One day at a time. In the pasture, Belle lifted her head toward the house, as if in silent agreement. November arrived with a sharp bite, bringing frost-covered mornings and the distinctive smell of wood smoke that hung in the air around Hank's farmhouse. The changing season had brought changes to Belle as well. Under Hank's dedicated care, guided by Tom's expertise and Jenny's scientific knowledge, the once-forgotten champion had continued her remarkable transformation. This brisk Tuesday morning found Hank in his small milking parlor, a converted corner of the barn that Tom had helped him outfit with second-hand equipment purchased from a retiring farmer in the next county. The rhythmic pulse of the simple milking machine created a soothing background noise as Belle stood patiently in the stanchion, seemingly content with this return to routine. That's my girl, Hank murmured, patting her flank as the last of the milk flowed into the stainless steel container. 7 gallons today? You're outdoing yourself. When he'd first attempted to milk Belle 3 weeks ago, she had produced barely 2 gallons. Now her production increased steadily each week, defying expectations for a cow of her age. More remarkable than the quantity, however, was the quality, something Hank had learned when the lab results Tom had arranged came back. The ringing of his cell phone interrupted his thoughts. Wiping his hands on a clean towel, Hank checked the caller ID. "Morning, Jenny," he answered, tucking the phone between his ear and shoulder as he released Belle from the stanchion. "Dad, did you get the email I forwarded?" His daughter's voice carried the excited tone that had become increasingly common in their conversations about Belle. "Just finished milking. Haven't checked my computer yet. It's from Dr. Patel at the University Dairy Science Department." She's beside herself over Belle's milk analysis. Jenny's words tumbled out rapidly. "The butterfat content is 5.8%. That's nearly 50% higher than average Jersey milk. And the protein structure. Dad, it's extraordinary. Dr. Patel wants to know if she can drive out to meet Belle in person." Hank guided Belle back to her stall, where fresh hay awaited. "I suppose that would be all right. What's her interest exactly?" "Research, primarily. The department has been studying genetic markers for exceptional milk production. Belle's samples show characteristics they've only theorized about until now." Jenny paused. "And there's more. Remember Lisa Thornton from my graduate program? She's working with that artisanal cheesemaker in Lawrence now, Meadowbrook Creamery." "Meadowbrook," Hank repeated, the coincidence striking him. No relation to Belle's original farm, just a popular name. "Anyway, Lisa nearly fainted when I sent her the analysis. She's offering to buy all of Belle's milk at 4 times the standard rate. Says it's perfect for their premium aged cheeses." Hank stared at Belle, who gazed back placidly while chewing her hay. 4 times the standard rate? That's about $180 per day at Belle's current production, Jenny filled in. "Over $5,000 a month, Dad." The figure hung in the air between them. Hank's small farm had always provided a modest living, supplemented by his pension from 30 years at the County Road Department. The idea that one rescued cow might generate more monthly income than his entire operation was difficult to comprehend. "There's a catch," Jenny continued, sensing his hesitation. "They'd need certification that the milk is being collected under proper conditions. You'd need to upgrade your setup, get regular inspections. Tom says he can help with all that, but there would be initial costs." "How much?" "About $15,000 for everything: equipment, permits, infrastructure modifications." Hank whistled softly. It wasn't an impossible sum, but it represented most of his modest savings. "It's your decision, Dad," Ginny said gently. "Belle's doing fine either way. You've already given her more than she could have hoped for." After ending the call, Hank sat on a hay bale, considering his options. Belle watched him with those intelligent eyes that seemed to understand far more than a cow should. "What do you think, old girl?" he asked. "Ready for another chapter in your story?" A week later, Hank's barn had become a hub of activity. Tom Sullivan had called in favors from half the county, bringing in friends to help install proper milk storage equipment, upgrade the electrical system, and create a small but efficient processing area. Dr. Patel from the university had visited, spending 3 hours examining Belle, taking samples, and exclaiming over her conformation and temperament. "Her genetics are a living history of American dairy development," the professor had explained enthusiastically. The traits that made her a champion weren't accidents. They were the culmination of generations of careful breeding. Even at her age, her milk composition is remarkable. Lisa Thornton from Meadowbrook Creamery had also made the trip, arriving with the company's master cheesemaker, a serious Frenchman named Marcel who had treated Belle's milk with the reverence usually reserved for fine wine. "This is extraordinary," he had proclaimed after a careful tasting. "Ze complexity, ze finish, magnifique. We will create a special cheese just for this milk. We will call it Belle's Reserve." Now, as the November sun sank toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the farmyard, Hank found himself alone with Belle once more. The last of the visitors had departed, leaving behind a transformed barn and a contract promising to purchase every drop of Belle's milk at premium prices for as long as she could produce. "Never thought I'd become a dairy farmer at my age," Hank told her as he administered her evening supplements, a special blend recommended by Dr. Patel to support her continued health and production. Sarah would have gotten a kick out of all this fuss. Belle's ears twitched at the mention of Sarah's name, something Hank had noticed happened often. Sometimes he liked to imagine his late wife somehow watching over both of them, perhaps even having orchestrated their unlikely meeting. "Tomorrow's the first official pickup," he said, stroking Belle's neck. "Your milk's going to become something special, something people will pay good money to taste." He chuckled softly. Not bad for a cow nobody wanted 3 months ago. The following morning brought the distinctive rumble of Meadowbrook Creamery's refrigerated truck up Hank's driveway. The driver, a young man named Carlos, greeted Hank warmly as he connected the hose to the small bulk tank that now gleamed in the corner of the barn. "Miss Thornton said to tell you they're all excited about this partnership, Mr. Peterson," Carlos said as he completed the necessary paperwork. "Marcel hasn't stopped talking about the cheese he's going to make." As the precious milk flowed into the truck's insulated compartment, Hank felt an unexpected sense of pride. It wasn't just the promise of income, though that would certainly make his retirement more comfortable. It was the knowledge that Belle's extraordinary gift would be recognized and appreciated once more. Later that afternoon, Ginny called to check on the first pickup. "Everything went smoothly," Hank reported. "Carlos said they'll be back every other day." "That's fantastic, Dad," Ginny replied. "Oh, and Dr. Patel called me. She wants to include Belle in a journal article she's writing about exceptional dairy genetics. Says she might be the oldest producing cow with her particular genetic markers." "From forgotten to famous," Hank mused. "Can't say I saw this coming when I raised my hand at that auction." "Sometimes the best decisions are the ones we can't entirely explain," Ginny said softly. "Like when Mom insisted on adopting that 3-legged cat no one wanted." "Tripod," Hank remembered with a smile. "Best Mauser we ever had, despite the handicap. She always saw potential where others didn't," Ginny agreed. "Maybe you inherited that gift." After they hung up, Hank walked out to the pasture where Belle grazed alongside his other cattle. In the late afternoon light, her caramel coat gleamed with health, belying her advanced age. She raised her head as he approached, then ambled over to the fence with the dignified gait she had developed as her strength returned. "You're a long way from that auction now," Hank said, scratching her favorite spot behind her ears. "Who would have thought you still had all this to give?" Belle leaned into his touch, her large eyes regarding him with what he could have sworn was gratitude. In that moment, standing in the golden light of a Kansas autumn, Hank Peterson realized he had done more than save an old cow from slaughter. He had rediscovered a champion hiding in plain sight, had helped restore her to her rightful place. And in doing so, Perhaps he had found something equally valuable for himself. A reminder that worth and purpose often transcend first appearances, and that sometimes the most valuable things are those others have deemed past their prime. "We're not done yet, are we, Belle?" he whispered. The gentle lowing he received in response seemed, to his ears at least, like a promise. December blanketed Hank's farm in pristine white, transforming the landscape into a serene winter wonderland. Inside the barn, warmth radiated from the recently installed heating system, another upgrade that had come with Belle's unexpected career revival. The sweet smell of hay mingled with the distinctive scent of healthy cattle as Hank completed the morning milking routine that had become second nature over the past month. "Another record day," he noted, recording Belle's production in the logbook Dr. Patel had provided. At nearly 8 gallons, the aging Jersey was outperforming cows half her age. Even more remarkably, the quality remained exceptional. The most recent analysis showed butterfat content continuing to rise as Belle's health improved. Hank patted her neck affectionately as he released her from the milking stanchion. "You're something else, you know that?" The ringing of his cell phone echoed through the barn. Tom Sullivan's name flashed on the screen. "Morning, Tom," Hank answered, tucking the phone against his shoulder as he continued his work. "Hank, have you checked your email today?" Tom's voice carried an unusual excitement. "Not yet. Been busy with morning chores." "Well, drop everything and take a look. The Oklahoma Livestock Exposition just announced their winter showcase. It's happening next month in Tulsa." Hank frowned in confusion. "What's that got to do with us?" "Everything," Tom exclaimed. "They've added a heritage dairy division this year, specifically for exemplary animals from traditional bloodlines. Belle would be perfect." Hank paused, milk pail in hand. "A competition?" "Tom, she's 15 years old." "Exactly. That's part of the point. This new division isn't just about current production. It's about celebrating animals that represent the best of American dairy heritage. Belle's lineage, her recovery story, her current production despite her age. She's the perfect embodiment of what they're trying to showcase." Hank watched Belle calmly eating her morning hay. The idea seemed preposterous, taking an elderly rescue cow to compete against animals specifically bred and raised for showing. "I don't know, Tom. She's doing great here, but a show environment is stressful. The travel alone might be too much." "Dr. Patel says she's healthy enough," Tom countered. "I already asked her opinion. Said Belle's vitals are stronger than many cows half her age." "You've been planning this," Hank accused, though without real anger. Tom chuckled. "Maybe a little. But think about it. This isn't just about winning ribbons. It's about Belle's story. About showing the world what gets lost when we discard animals because they're past their commercial prime. About the value of heritage genetics." By the time they ended the call, Hank had reluctantly agreed to consider the idea. When he mentioned it to Jenny during their weekly Sunday dinner, he expected her to side with his caution. Instead, her eyes lit up with the same enthusiasm Tom had expressed. "Dad, it's perfect. The exposure alone would be incredible for Meadowbrook Creamery's marketing of Belle's cheese line." She pushed away her empty plate, leaning forward earnestly. "And think about the educational impact. Dr. Patel is already using Belle as a case study in her advanced dairy science course." "It's not a small undertaking," Hank protested. "Tulsa's nearly 4 hours away. Belle hasn't traveled that far in years, if ever." "We'll make it comfortable for her," Jenny assured him. "I'll come home that weekend. We'll rent a top-quality livestock trailer with climate control. Tom knows the show circuit. He'll help with everything." Hank glanced out the window to where Belle's barn stood, lights glowing warmly against the winter darkness. What if she doesn't win anything? What if it's too much for her? Jenny reached across the table, covering his weathered hand with her own. "Dad, Belle's already won by surviving. By finding you. By getting this second chance. A ribbon would just be confirmation of what we already know." 2 weeks later, Hank found himself standing in his bedroom, staring at the pressed Western shirt and BOLO tie that Sarah had given him for their anniversary nearly a decade ago. The Oklahoma Livestock Exposition was 3 days away, and despite his continued reservations, preparations were in full swing. Tom had been by daily, coaching Hank on show protocols and helping groom Belle to competition standards. Dr. Patel had conducted a thorough examination and declared Belle fit for travel, providing detailed instructions for her care before, during, and after the show. Even Lisa Thornton from Meadowbrook Creamery had visited, bringing samples of Bell's Reserve, the premium cheese now aging in their facilities, made exclusively from Bell's extraordinary milk. "What am I getting us into, Sarah?" Hank murmured to his empty bedroom, fingers tracing the turquoise stones in the BOLO tie. The weight of it felt strange after years in the drawer. The day of departure dawned clear and cold. Tom arrived before sunrise in his heavy-duty pickup, towing a gleaming aluminum livestock trailer that looked far too luxurious for a farm animal. "Borrowed it from my cousin in Nebraska," Tom explained as they led Belle up the padded ramp. "He shows Angus bulls nationally. Cost more than my first house, but Belle deserves the best." To Hank's relief, Belle entered the trailer without hesitation, seeming to understand that this journey was somehow important. Jenny arranged soft bedding in the spacious compartment while Hank secured fresh hay and water for the trip. "Oklahoma Livestock Exposition, here we come," Tom announced as they pulled away from the farm, the winter sun just beginning to illuminate the eastern horizon. The journey passed more smoothly than Hank had anticipated. They stopped twice to check on Belle, finding her calm and comfortable each time. By early afternoon, the Tulsa skyline appeared in the distance, and soon they were navigating toward the expo grounds, an impressive complex of buildings and arenas dedicated to showcasing the best of American agriculture. "Registration desk is this way," Tom directed, consulting the map they'd been provided. "Heritage Dairy Division is in Pavilion C, with judging tomorrow morning at 9. The exhibition halls buzzed with activity, farmers and ranchers from across the region unloading prized animals, setting up elaborate stalls, and exchanging news and gossip. As they led Belle to her assigned space, Hank noticed curious glances from neighboring exhibitors. "Is that a Meadowbrook jersey?" a middle-aged woman asked, pausing as she brushed a young Holstein heifer. "The marking looks familiar." "Yes, ma'am," Tom answered before Hank could respond. "Meadowbrook's Golden Belle herself." The woman's eyes widened. "The Golden Belle? Richard Harrington's champion? That's impossible. She'd be ancient by now." 15 years old, Hank confirmed quietly, and still producing over 7 gallons daily. Word spread quickly through the pavilion. Throughout the afternoon, a steady stream of visitors stopped by Belle's stall: dairy farmers, breed historians, agricultural students, each with questions about the legendary cow everyone had assumed was long gone. "I saw her win the National Jersey Show in 2014, an elderly gentleman in overalls told Hank, emotion making his voice rough. "Finest example of the breed I've ever seen. Never thought I'd lay eyes on her again." By evening, when the exhibition halls quieted for the night, Hank was exhausted from the constant attention. He arranged Belle's bedding one final time, ensuring she had fresh water and hay for the night. "Big day tomorrow, old girl," he murmured, stroking her soft muzzle. "Just be yourself. That's more than enough." Jenny and Tom insisted on taking Hank to dinner at a nearby steakhouse, celebrating their successful arrival with thick ribeyes and loaded baked potatoes. To Belle, Tom proposed, raising his glass. "May tomorrow bring the recognition she deserves." "And to Dad," Jenny added, "for seeing her worth when no one else did." Hank smiled, uncomfortable with the praise but touched nonetheless. "To second chances," he countered, "for cows and people alike." Morning arrived with a flurry of activity. Hank was up before dawn, returning to the expo grounds to find Tom already there, carefully grooming Belle with specialized brushes and sprays. "Got to look her best," Tom explained, working methodically on her caramel coat until it gleamed under the barn lights. Judge for the Heritage Division is Samuel Wilson from Cornell, expert in traditional breeding lines. As the judging hour approached, competitors from across the country led their animals toward the show ring. Unlike Belle, most were young, in their prime production years, immaculately groomed and handled by experienced showmen in crisp white coats. "Everyone's staring," Hank muttered as he guided Belle toward the ring. Indeed, whispers followed their progress, some curious, some skeptical, some openly dismissive. "Let them stare," Jenny said firmly, walking alongside. "They'll understand soon enough." The Heritage Dairy Division featured 12 animals representing different traditional bloodlines: Guernseys, Ayrshires, Brown Swiss, and 3 jerseys including Belle. As they entered the sawdust-covered ring, Hank felt suddenly out of place among the professional handlers. "Just keep her moving clockwise," Tom coached from the sidelines. Let the judge see her natural gait. Don't force anything. Judge Wilson, a tall man with silver hair and penetrating eyes, moved deliberately among the contestants. He examined each animal methodically, checking teeth, feeling udders, assessing conformation with practiced hands. When he reached Belle, his professional demeanor briefly faltered. "Is this?" he began, then collected himself. "Please walk her once around the ring." Hank complied, acutely aware of the audience watching from the bleachers surrounding the show ring. Belle moved with surprising grace for her age, head held high as if she remembered what was expected in this familiar environment. "Remarkable," the judge murmured, running expert hands along Belle's frame. "Absolutely remarkable preservation of the classic Meadowbrook conformation." After completing his evaluation of all contestants, Judge Wilson stepped to the center of the ring. The pavilion fell silent as he prepared to announce his decision. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice carrying through the sound system, "the Heritage Division represents our commitment to preserving the genetic diversity and traditional excellence of American dairy breeds. Each animal here carries bloodlines that have contributed significantly to our agricultural heritage." He paused, surveying the contestants once more. "In this division, we consider not only current conformation and production, but historical significance and adherence to traditional breed standards." Another pause. "It is therefore my honor to announce as our champion an animal that represents the very best of American dairy breeding, a living link to one of the most influential bloodlines in Jersey history." Hank felt his heart hammering in his chest as the judge turned toward them. Meadowbrook's Golden Belle, shown by Hank Peterson of Kansas. For a moment, Hank couldn't move. The audience's reaction was immediate, gasps, then applause, building to a standing ovation as the significance of the moment registered. This wasn't just any win. It was the return of a legend, a champion everyone had assumed was lost to history. As Hank accepted the blue ribbon with trembling hands, Belle stood calmly beside him, seemingly unaffected by the commotion. Perhaps, he thought, she had known all along what she was capable of, had simply been waiting for someone to give her the chance to show it. Later, surrounded by admirers and agricultural journalists eager for Belle's story, Hank watched as Jenny fielded questions with practiced ease. The tale of Belle's journey from forgotten auction lot to celebrated champion seemed to touch everyone who heard it. "What made you bid on her that day?" a reporter from the Agricultural Journal asked Hank. "How did you recognize her potential when everyone else overlooked her?" Hank considered the question, his hand resting on Belle's warm flank. "I didn't," he answered honestly. "I just saw a living creature that deserved dignity. The rest," he smiled, meeting Belle's serene gaze, "the rest was all her doing." As evening fell and the crowds dispersed, Hank remained by Belle's stall, the blue ribbon hanging prominently on the gate. Tomorrow would bring more attention, more questions, perhaps even offers from those eager to claim a connection to her remarkable genetics. But for now, in the quiet aftermath of triumph, it was just the two of them, an aging widower and a once-forgotten champion, both discovering that life's most meaningful victories often come when least expected. "You did good, Belle," Hank whispered. "You did real good." January in Kansas brought bitter cold that seeped through walls and froze water in buckets despite the barn's heating system. Snow piled in drifts against fences and outbuildings, transforming Hank's modest farm into a landscape of pristine white broken only by the dark figures of cattle and the trails of footprints leading from house to barn. Inside the main house, warmth and conversation filled the kitchen. The large oak table was covered with newspapers, agricultural journals, and glossy magazines, all featuring Belle's remarkable story. Her unexpected triumph at the Oklahoma Livestock Exposition had captured the imagination of the farming community and beyond. "Have you seen this one?" Jenny asked, pushing the latest issue of Modern Farmer toward her father. Belle's dignified profile graced the cover, alongside the headline, "The Champion's Return: How an Abandoned Dairy Cow Reclaimed Her Legacy." Hank nodded, his weathered fingers wrapped around a mug of coffee. "Tom brought it by yesterday. Said he's thinking of framing it." Tom Sullivan sat across from them, beaming with pride as if Belle were his own discovery. "Frame it? I ordered 20 copies, sending them to every dairy farmer I know." He tapped the article emphatically. "This is history, Hank. People will be talking about Belle's comeback for generations. The 3 weeks since their return from Tulsa had brought a whirlwind of attention. Agricultural journalists, dairy breed historians, and even a film crew from a popular streaming services documentary division had made the pilgrimage to Hank's farm. Belle had received it all with the same placid dignity that had first caught Hank's eye at the auction, seemingly unruffled by cameras or the constant stream of visitors. "The cheese is selling out faster than they can age it," Ginny reported, glancing at her laptop. "Lisa says Belle's Reserve has a 6-month waiting list now. They're raising the price to $50 per pound, and people still want it." Hank shook his head in wonder. The financial aspect still felt surreal. His modest farm now generating more income from one elderly cow than it had from all previous operations combined. The bank account he had worried might never stretch through his retirement years was growing steadily each month. "And the breeding requests?" Tom asked, helping himself to another slice of Ginny's apple pie. Ginny scrolled through her emails. 17 so far. Breeders from as far away as Canada and Argentina. They're all interested in embryo transfer using Belle's eggs and elite sires. Tom whistled appreciatively. That could be another substantial income stream, Hank. Modern techniques mean minimal stress for Belle, and her genetics would be preserved for future generations. Hank's expression remained thoughtful. The breeding requests had been the most unexpected consequence of Belle's newfound fame. Leading dairy operations around the world now hoped to incorporate her exceptional genetics into their herds. Genetics that had nearly been lost forever when she was discarded as worthless. "I'm still thinking it over," he said finally. "Dr. Patel says it would be safe, but Belle's already given so much. Don't want to push her just because we can." Before either Tom or Ginny could respond, a knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Max barked once from his place by the fireplace, then subsided, recognizing a familiar scent. "That'll be Dr. Martinez," Hank said, rising to answer. The local veterinarian had been making weekly visits to monitor Belle's health since their return from Oklahoma, partly out of professional interest and partly, Hank suspected, to maintain his connection to the now-famous bovine. Dr. Martinez stamped snow from his boots as he entered, bringing a gust of cold air that momentarily chilled the kitchen. "Morning, folks. How's our celebrity patient today?" "Serene as ever," Hank replied. "Just finished milking an hour ago. Nearly 9 gallons, another personal best." The vet shook his head in amazement. "At her age, that's nothing short of miraculous. Mind if I head out to check on her? Got a new nutritional supplement I'd like to try. Might help maintain her calcium levels through the rest of winter." As Dr. Martinez and Tom headed to the barn, Ginny closed her laptop and regarded her father thoughtfully. "What's really on your mind about the breeding requests, Dad? Is it Belle's health or something else?" Hank sighed, gazing out the window toward the barn. "Partly her health, sure. But also," he hesitated, searching for words. "Feels like we might be falling into the same pattern that failed her before. Valuing her for what we can get from her, rather than for herself." Ginny considered this. "I understand that. But isn't there a middle ground? Her genetics are remarkable. Preserving them would be honoring her legacy, not exploiting her." "Maybe," Hank conceded. "Just want to be sure we're making decisions for the right reasons." Their conversation was interrupted by Tom bursting back through the door, face flushed with excitement. "Hank, you need to get out to the barn. Dr. Martinez found something during his examination." Alarmed, Hank rose immediately. "Is Belle okay?" Tom grinned, eyes twinkling. "Better than okay. She's pregnant." The news hung in the air for a moment before Ginny gasped. "Pregnant? That's impossible. She hasn't been near a bull since." "Since before the auction," Tom finished. "Dr. Martinez estimates she's about 5 months along. Must have been bred shortly before being sent to Amarillo." Hank sank back into his chair, stunned. 5 months. But how did we miss it? How did Dr. Patel miss it during all her examinations? Early pregnancy in older cows can be easy to overlook, especially when no one's looking for it, Tom explained. Belle's improvements in condition masked the usual signs. Dr. Martinez only noticed today because he was specifically checking her calcium levels. The implications slowly dawned on Hank. So all this time, while we've been restoring her health, building her strength, she's been nurturing new life, Ginny finished softly. "Oh, Dad, it's perfect." The next 4 months passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Belle's pregnancy became yet another chapter in her remarkable story, covered by agricultural media and even mentioned in mainstream news outlets. Dr. Patel adjusted Belle's nutrition and care regimen to support both her continued milk production, which they gradually reduced, and the developing calf. It's extremely rare for a cow her age to maintain a healthy pregnancy, the professor explained during one of her now regular visits. But Belle's overall health is exceptional. All indicators point to a normal delivery. The breeding requests were temporarily shelved as everyone focused on the impending birth. Tom spent hours researching Belle's lineage, trying to determine which bull might have sired the calf. Based on where she was before the auction, I've narrowed it down to 3 possibilities, he reported one evening in late April, spreading papers across Hank's kitchen table. All premium Jersey sires from the Hernandez operation. Any of them would make this calf extremely valuable. As May approached, Hank prepared a special stall in the barn, spacious, deeply bedded with fresh straw, and equipped with monitoring cameras that Jenny had insisted on installing. "We are not missing a minute of this," she declared, setting up a system that would alert their phones when Belle showed signs of labor. The fateful call came at 3:17 a.m. on a mild spring morning. Hank, who had taken to sleeping in the spare room closest to the barn, was awakened by Jenny's voice from the monitoring system. "Dad, it's starting. Get out to the barn." The next 2 hours were a mixture of tension and wonder as Belle calmly brought new life into the world. Dr. Martinez arrived halfway through, but largely observed rather than intervened. Belle knew what she was doing, her maternal instincts intact despite her age and the years of neglect she had endured. Just as dawn broke over the eastern horizon, painting the sky in delicate pinks and golds, a perfect Jersey heifer calf slipped into the world. Belle immediately began cleaning her offspring with gentle licks, encouraging the newborn to rise on wobbly legs. "She's beautiful," Jenny whispered, tears streaming down her face as she recorded the moment on her phone. "Look at those markings, identical to Belle's star pattern on her forehead." Dr. Martinez completed his examination of both mother and calf, beaming with professional satisfaction. Healthy delivery, healthy calf, healthy mother. Couldn't ask for a better outcome. As the morning progressed, news of the birth spread rapidly through their now extensive network of agricultural contacts. By noon, the first congratulatory calls were coming in. Lisa Thornton from Meadowbrook Creamery was among the earliest, proposing a name for the new arrival. "Renaissance," she suggested over the speakerphone. "It means rebirth, a new beginning. Meadowbrook's Renaissance, continuing her mother's legacy." The name seemed fitting, and by evening, official registration paperwork was underway. Unlike her mother, Renaissance would have her lineage documented, her genetic value recognized from birth. As twilight settled over the farm, Hank sat on a bale of hay in Belle's stall, watching mother and daughter with quiet amazement. Belle had positioned herself protectively around her calf, occasionally nudging the sleeping newborn with gentle affection. "You were protecting her all along," Hank murmured, reaching out to stroke Belle's neck. "Even at the auction, when everyone thought you were just a worn-out old cow, you were guarding new life inside you." Belle's large eyes regarded him with what he could only interpret as contentment. In that moment, Hank Peterson understood that their journey together had never been about ribbons or recognition or financial reward. It had been about recognizing inherent value in an aging cow, in an aging man, in traditions and genetics and ways of life that the modern world too often discarded as obsolete. The next morning, as Hank moved through his chores with a renewed sense of purpose, Tom's truck rattled up the driveway. The old cattleman hurried toward him, waving a newspaper. "Have you seen this?" Tom called, breathless with excitement. Front page of the Regional Agricultural Bulletin. The headline read, "Golden Belle's Golden Legacy. Champion cow delivers healthy heifer at age 15. Below was a photograph of Belle and Renaissance, the caption noting that experts considered it perhaps the most valuable Jersey calf born in North America this year, representing the unexpected continuation of a legendary bloodline. Hank accepted the paper with a nod of thanks, but his attention was already drifting back to the barn where mother and daughter rested. Prizes and publicity, valuable genetics, and premium prices, these things mattered in their way. But what mattered more was the simple miracle he had witnessed. Life continuing, legacy preserved, value recognized. She had one more surprise for us, Hank said softly. One more reminder that you can't always judge worth by appearances. Tom clapped him on the shoulder. And one more reminder that sometimes the best decisions are the ones we make with our hearts instead of our ledger books. In the barn, Belle greeted Hank with a soft, lowing sound, her calf nursing vigorously at her side. Renaissance, a name that spoke of revival, of something precious nearly lost but now restored. Outside, spring sunlight bathed the Kansas landscape in golden light, promising renewal and growth after the long winter. And Hank Peterson, who had once been simply a lonely widower passing time on his small farm, now stood at the center of a story of redemption that had touched hearts across the country. A reminder that sometimes, seeing value where others see only decline can lead to the most unexpected and rewarding of journeys. The summer air hung heavy over the Kansas landscape, shimmering with heat and the sweet scent of alfalfa. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows of Hank's kitchen, illuminating the collection of photographs, news clippings, and awards that now adorned the previously sparse walls. At the center was a framed portrait of Belle and Renaissance, taken by a professional photographer from National Geographic who had visited the farm 2 months earlier for a feature on agricultural heritage preservation. Hank poured coffee for the guests seated around his kitchen table: Tom Sullivan, Jenny, Dr. Patel from the university, and Lisa Thornton from Meadowbrook Creamery. Their regular Belle Committee meetings, as Tom jokingly called them, had become a fixture of Hank's life over the past 3 months since Renaissance's birth. Renaissance is already outpacing growth projections, Dr. Patel reported, reviewing her tablet notes. At 3 months, she's showing developmental markers typical of calves at 4 months. The genetic potential is extraordinary. Jenny nodded, adding, her temperament is remarkable too. Same calm intelligence as Belle. The students in the 4-H program adore her. The arrangement had been Jenny's idea, bringing local 4-H youth to the farm twice weekly to help care for Renaissance while learning about dairy heritage and genetics. What had started as a small educational initiative had blossomed into a popular program with a waiting list of eager students. The latest batch of Belle's Reserve cheese sold out in 6 hours, Lisa reported. We're expanding production capacity, but demand continues to outpace supply. She smiled at Hank. The mother and daughter gift packages we're planning for the holidays, Belle's cheese paired with Renaissance-branded dairy products, have pre-orders exceeding our most optimistic projections. Tom chuckled, leaning back in his chair. Not bad for a cow nobody wanted. The phrase had become something of a mantra among them, a reminder of how close they had come to losing Belle and her genetic legacy forever. In the 6 months since the Oklahoma Livestock Exposition, Belle's story had transcended agricultural circles to capture broader public interest. A children's book titled Belle's Journey Home was already in development, and a documentary filmmaker was scheduled to begin shooting next month. Speaking of nobody wanting, Dr. Patel said, her expression growing serious, I've been meaning to discuss the National Dairy Heritage Foundation's new initiative with you all. The room quieted as she continued. The foundation is establishing a sanctuary program for aging dairy cows with exceptional genetics or production histories, animals that would otherwise be culled once their prime productive years end. She glanced at Belle through the window, visible in her favorite shaded area of the nearest pasture. Belle's story has been a catalyst for the initiative. The foundation's board wants to name the program after her. The Belle Sanctuary Program, Jenny said thoughtfully. It has a nice ring to it. Hank remained silent, turning the idea over in his mind. When he had impulsively raised his hand at that auction in Texas, he could never have imagined the ripple effects his simple act of compassion would create. Now, other aging cows might be spared Belle's fate, their value recognized beyond their immediate productivity. There's more, Dr. Patel continued. They're interested in making your farm the flagship location, Hank, with funding for expansion, educational facilities, visitor accommodations, essentially transforming it into a working demonstration farm and sanctuary. Of course, you'd maintain ownership and operational control. The proposal hung in the air, its implications gradually sinking in. Tom let out a low whistle. That's substantial, Hank finally said. I need time to think it over. Of course, Dr. Patel nodded. No rush for an answer. They're prepared to be very flexible with the arrangements. After the meeting concluded and the guests departed, Hank walked out to the pasture where Belle and Renaissance grazed together. The bond between mother and daughter was evident in their synchronized movements and protective positioning. Belle constantly aware of her calves' whereabouts despite Renaissance's increasingly independent explorations. "What do you think, girls?" Hank asked, leaning on the fence, ready to become the center of something bigger than all of us. Belle raised her head, regarding him with those intelligent eyes that had first captured his attention at the auction. Sometimes Hank could almost convince himself she understood every word. That evening, he sat alone on his porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The proposal weighed on his mind, not because he opposed it, but because accepting would irrevocably transform his quiet retirement into something far more public and demanding. The screen door creaked as Jenny stepped outside, 2 glasses of iced tea in hand. She had stayed behind after the others left, sensing her father might need time to process the day's discussions. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, settling into the chair beside him and offering one of the glasses. Hank accepted the tea with a nod of thanks. "Just wondering what your mother would make of all this. The farm becoming some kind of institution." Jenny smiled softly. "Mom would love it. You know how she was always bringing strays home, always fighting for the underdog." She paused, watching a hummingbird dart around the feeder hanging from the porch eave. "But she'd want you to be sure it's what you want, not just what everyone else thinks is a good idea." They sat in comfortable silence as twilight deepened around them. Fireflies began to appear, their gentle blinking creating a dance of light across the darkening yard. "I keep thinking about that day at the auction," Hank said finally. "How close Belle came to a very different ending. How many others like her don't get a second chance?" Jenny nodded, understanding. "It's not your responsibility to save them all, Dad." "No," he agreed. "But maybe it is my responsibility to use what's happened here to change how people think, to show there's value beyond the obvious, beyond youth and peak productivity." The following morning, Hank rose early, his decision crystallizing with the dawning day. After completing his chores, he placed a call to Dr. Patel, accepting the foundation's proposal with a few conditions, primarily that the educational aspects emphasize compassionate agriculture and the importance of heritage preservation. The progression from private farm to sanctuary headquarters happened gradually over the next 6 months. Architects designed additions that complemented the existing structures rather than overwhelming them. Local craftsmen, many of whom had followed Belle's story from the beginning, offered their services at reduced rates. The community embraced the project with unexpected enthusiasm, recognizing its potential to put their small corner of Kansas on the map. By the following spring, as Renaissance approached her first birthday, the transformation was well underway. A modest visitor center had been constructed near the entrance to the property, educational signage installed along carefully planned pathways, and the barn expanded to accommodate both the existing animals and future sanctuary residents. On a perfect May morning, with wildflowers blooming across the pastures and birds singing in the ancient oak that shaded the farmhouse, the Belle Sanctuary officially opened to the public. A small ceremony preceded the ribbon cutting, nothing elaborate at Hank's insistence, but meaningful nonetheless. Representatives from agricultural organizations, universities, and media outlets gathered in front of the visitor center, where Belle and Renaissance had been positioned in a temporarily fenced area, groomed to perfection for the occasion. Dr. Patel spoke briefly about the sanctuary's mission, followed by Lisa Thornton, who announced that Meadowbrook Creamery would donate a percentage of all Belle's Reserve cheese sales to support the sanctuary's operations. A state senator praised the initiative as a model of agricultural heritage preservation with national significance. When it came time for Hank to speak, he hesitated, uncomfortable with public attention despite months of increasing visibility. Jenny squeezed his arm encouragingly. "I'm not much for speeches," he began, looking out at the assembled crowd. "Never expected to be standing here like this. Never expected any of this, truth be told." He glanced toward Belle, who gazed back placidly, Renaissance at her side. "All I did was follow an impulse that day at the auction. All I did was see value where others didn't." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Belle's done all the real work. She's the one who held on through years of decline and neglect. She's the one who kept that spark alive inside her, waiting for a chance to shine again." His voice grew stronger, conviction evident in every word. And she's not unique in that way. There are countless others, animals and people too, who get discarded when they're deemed past their prime, when their value isn't obvious at first glance. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the audience. This sanctuary isn't just about saving cows, Hank continued. It's about challenging how we measure worth. It's about recognizing that sometimes the greatest value lies beneath the surface, waiting for someone to take a second look. He smiled slightly. Sometimes all it takes is someone raising their hand when everyone else has turned away. As the ribbon was cut and visitors began to explore the sanctuary grounds, Hank found himself surrounded by well-wishers and media representatives, all eager for additional comments or photographs. Through it all, he maintained a humble demeanor, consistently redirecting attention to Belle rather than himself. Later that afternoon, as the official festivities wound down, Hank slipped away from the crowds to a quiet corner of the main pasture. Belle and Renaissance had been returned to their normal environment, free from the constraints of the ceremonial area. They grazed contentedly some distance away, apparently unaffected by the day's excitement. Tom Sullivan found him there, leaning against the fence in contemplative silence. "Quite a day," the older man remarked, settling beside Hank with the ease of long friendship. From nearly becoming Hamburger to having a national sanctuary named after her. "Not bad for an old cow." "Not bad for an old cow," Hank echoed with a smile. They watched as Renaissance romped playfully around her more sedate mother, youthful energy contrasting with Belle's mature dignity. "You know what strikes me most about Belle's story?" Tom said after a while. "It's not just about second chances or recognizing hidden value, though those are important parts of it." "What then?" Hank asked, curious. "It's about continuity," Tom replied thoughtfully. "About the threads that connect past and future. Belle isn't just a rescue case. She's a living link to agricultural traditions we almost lost. And Renaissance isn't just any calf. She's the continuation of a legacy that almost disappeared." Hank considered this, watching the mother and daughter against the backdrop of the Kansas landscape that had been home to his own family for generations. "I think you're right," he said finally. "Though I didn't see it that way at first. I just saw an old cow nobody wanted. And now I see." Hank paused, searching for the right words. "I see potential. In Belle, in Renaissance, in this place. In the idea that worth isn't always obvious, that decline isn't always permanent, that what seems like an ending might actually be a beginning." As the sun began its westward descent, casting long shadows across the pasture, visitors to the sanctuary paused in their explorations to watch Belle and Renaissance. Many took photographs, some simply observed in appreciative silence. Children pointed excitedly, having heard Belle's story read to them from the newly published picture book available in the gift shop. Standing somewhat apart from the visitors, Hank felt a complex mixture of emotions: pride in what Belle had accomplished, satisfaction in the sanctuary's successful launch, and a sense of purpose he had thought lost after Sarah's passing. His impulsive bid at a Texas cattle auction had set in motion a chain of events none of them could have predicted, transforming not just Belle's life, but his own. As twilight approached and the last visitors departed, Hank made his final rounds of the day. In Belle's stall, freshly bedded with sweet-smelling straw, he found a small envelope addressed to him in unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a brief note and a faded photograph of a much younger Belle in her championship days, bedecked with blue ribbons and surrounded by admiring crowds. The note read simply, "Mr. Peterson, I worked for Richard Harrington at Meadowbrook for 20 years. Belle was his favorite, the culmination of his life's work. He would be profoundly grateful for what you've done. Some things are meant to endure. Margaret Wilson, former Meadowbrook herd manager." Hank carefully returned the photograph to the envelope, deeply moved by this connection to Belle's distant past. He stroked her neck as she settled into her stall for the night, Renaissance beside her. "You were always more than just an old cow," he murmured. "I just didn't know how much more." Belle's intelligent eyes met his, and for a moment, Hank felt the convergence of past, present, and future in this quiet exchange between man and animal. What had begun as an act of compassion had evolved into something far greater, a reminder that value transcends appearance, that legacies matter, that sometimes the most meaningful journeys begin with the smallest of gestures. As Hank walked back to his farmhouse beneath a canopy of emerging stars, he felt a profound sense of rightness. The sanctuary would grow, Belle's story would continue to inspire, and Renaissance would carry her mother's exceptional genetics into future generations. What had almost been lost had not only been saved, but had flourished beyond anyone's expectations. And in that flourishing, Hank Peterson had found his own renaissance, a renewed purpose that honored Sarah's memory while creating something uniquely meaningful. Not just a refuge for aging dairy cows, but a testament to the enduring value of compassion, heritage, and the courage to see potential where others see only decline. Belle's journey from forgotten auction lot to celebrated symbol of resilience was complete. But in many ways, her story, and Hank's, was just beginning. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and if you've watched this far, comment, "I watched until here," and share your opinion about this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video that appears on the end screen. It's very exciting.